You need to stop whatever you are doing right now. Because what just happened between Canada and the United States in the last few weeks is something that no political analyst, no economist, and no trade expert in Washington actually predicted. And the consequences of what Canada just pulled off are going to ripple through the American economy in ways that most people in this country still do not fully understand. Here is the short version before we go deep. Trump issued an ultimatum to Canada, and Canada did not just refuse to comply. Canada responded by accelerating the most dramatic economic repositioning any developed nation has executed in the post-war era. The data is now in. The numbers have been confirmed, and they tell a story that the mainstream coverage is giving you in fragments but never assembling in one place. Today, we are going to give you the full picture, every number, every consequence. Every reason why what just happened is not a Canadian story. It is an American story because it is American workers, American consumers, and American manufacturers who are going to feel this in their wallets before the year is out. Before we go any further, if you have been following this trade war and you want to understand what is actually happening versus what Washington wants you to believe is happening, hit subscribe right now and tap that bell, because this channel covers every development in real time with the numbers, the sources, and the context that the headline coverage consistently leaves out. We are going to be on this story every single day between now and July 1st, and you need to be here for every update. Let us start where this story actually starts, not with the tariffs, not with the ultimatums, but with a calculation that someone in Washington made and that has now been proven catastrophically wrong by the data. The calculation went like this. Canada sends 77% of everything it exports to the United States. Canada's economy is more dependent on American buyers than any other developed nation on earth. Canada has been building this dependency for decades. The auto industry, the oil sector, the agricultural supply chains, the aluminum mills in Quebec, the potash fields in Saskatchewan, all of it oriented southward, all of it built around frictionless access to the American market. Washington looked at those numbers and concluded that Canada has no leverage, no alternatives, and that Canada will fold. And on paper, if you were looking only at the numbers and not at the man who had just become prime minister, the calculation made sense. But what Washington fundamentally missed is that Mark Carney had spent 13 years as a central banker studying exactly what happens when you apply economic pressure to a country that looks like it has no alternatives. He understood at a level that no career politician in this fight understood that leverage is not static, that it shifts, that every single day a trade war runs, the leverage calculation changes, and that the country that prepares for that shift before the pressure arrives is the country that wins. Mark Carney had been preparing for exactly this moment, and the data published over the last several weeks proves it. Now let us talk about the ultimatum itself. In January of this year, Canada's new Prime Minister flew to Beijing, the first visit by a Canadian head of government to China in a decade. He came back with a deal. China agreed to cut its tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 85% down to roughly 15%, opening $4 billion in annual agricultural trade that had been effectively blocked for years. Canada agreed to allow an initial annual quota of 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles at a tariff rate of 6.1% instead of 100%. Beef market access for 20 Canadian meat establishments was restored. Carney framed the deal as a tactical correction of trade barriers, not a free trade agreement, not a backdoor route for Chinese goods into the American market. Trump's response was posted on Truth Social within days. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, Trump wrote, he is sorely mistaken. And then the ultimatum. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, 100% on everything, against the backdrop of $1.9 trillion in annual trade, against the backdrop of a $30 billion agricultural relationship in which Canada is the fourth largest buyer of American farm products. Against the backdrop of a supply chain so integrated that a single car assembled in Michigan can have its parts cross the border 6 to 8 times before the vehicle is complete. And Carney's response? He stood in front of reporters in Ottawa and calmly explained what the deal actually said. He noted that Trump himself had made a structurally similar arrangement with China at a summit the previous summer. He noted the deal was entirely consistent with Canada's obligations under the existing trade agreement. He declined to reverse it. And then he launched a domestic program called Buy Canadian, prioritizing Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, and Canadian technology in national infrastructure projects as a direct structural response to the uncertainty created by the American ultimatum. He did not fold. He did not ask for a reprieve. He looked at the 100% tariff threat, answered it point by point on the facts, and kept building. Now let us go back a few weeks before the China ultimatum, because there is a scene in this story that captures something essential about who Mark Carney is. January 2026, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, the most powerful gathering of economic leaders on the planet. And Mark Carney took the stage and gave a speech that earned something very rare in that room, a standing ovation. He did not congratulate Trump. He did not express hope for a future negotiation. He said the world was in the middle of what he called a rupture, not a transition. He said the 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, forging alliances rooted in trust and championing the free exchange of goods and services, is over. Trump responded from the sidelines. Canada lives because of the United States, he said. Remember that, Mark? And then Trump revoked Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace. Carney accepted the removal with a single statement. Canada thrives because it is Canadian. This is the entire dynamic of this trade war in 2 sentences. Trump threatens. Carney responds with a fact. Trump escalates. Carney accelerates the strategy he had already been building long before the first tariff was imposed. Drop a comment right now and tell me something. When Trump launched this trade war, did you believe that within 12 months, Canada would be signing deals with China, Indonesia, the UAE, Australia, Japan, India, Norway, and the European Union, while simultaneously recovering $11 billion in lost exports through 27 new trading partners? Because I want to know if you saw this coming. Leave it below. Almost nobody in Washington did. And the reason they did not is the reason this story matters so much for every American watching right now. Let us put the actual data on the table. The Globe and Mail, citing Statistics Canada figures confirmed by TD Economics and the RSM research team, reported that Canadian firms have now recovered nearly $11 billion of the $18.5 billion in American-bound exports they lost when Trump's tariffs hit at full force. $11 billion through 27 new trading partners in less than 12 months. Statistics. Canada recorded the second largest monthly surge in non-American merchandise exports in the country's recorded history, a 24.8% increase in a single reporting period. Simultaneously, exports to the United States fell 6.6%, the largest drop since the height of the pandemic in 2020. Read those 2 numbers together. Non-American exports up 24.8%, second largest in recorded history. American-bound exports down 6.6%, largest drop since the pandemic. The RSM research team confirmed explicitly that this recovery represents a structural shift, not a temporary adjustment. The trade routes being established now are being locked in with long-term contracts and regulatory frameworks that will not simply reverse when American tariff policy changes. Now let us look at exactly where those $11 billion went, because the geographic spread tells you everything about the deliberateness of the strategy. The United Kingdom absorbed $14.1 billion in additional Canadian exports, driven primarily by gold. China took an additional $3.5 billion. The Netherlands added $2.2 billion. Germany added $1.9 billion. And then Singapore, Spain, Indonesia, Brazil, France, and Italy collectively absorbed another $4 billion in Canadian goods that had previously flowed south. That is virtually every major trading bloc on the planet represented in a single data set. This is not accident. This is the direct result of a prime minister who spent the first year of his government traveling to every major economy on Earth and signing agreements that gave Canadian exporters real alternatives before the full weight of American tariffs landed. 12 deals, 4 continents, less than a year. And the Wall Street Journal described Canada's trade diversification as happening faster than many analysts expected. Here's the part of this story that Washington never fully accounted for, and that explains why the leverage calculation was flawed from the beginning. The Trans Mountain Expansion Project, a pipeline running west from Alberta's oil fields to the Pacific coast at Burnaby, British Columbia. It entered commercial operation in May of 2024, before the trade war formally began, before the tariffs, before the ultimatums. It increased Canada's oil export capacity from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000 barrels per day. And it runs west to the Pacific, not south to the American border. Before the Trans Mountain expansion, Canadian oil exports to Asia were essentially zero at commercial scale. After the expansion, those exports were averaging more than $660 million per month. And according to Reuters reporting, in the months following, Canada exported more seaborne crude oil to China than to the United States for the first time in history. Think about what that single fact means for a pressure strategy built entirely on the assumption that Canadian oil had nowhere to go but south. That assumption was already wrong by the time the first tariff was imposed. The pipeline that changed everything had been built, with Canadian money and Canadian workers, before Trump threatened his first dollar of tariffs. Now here is the part that every single American watching this needs to sit with for a moment, because this is not happening in another country with no consequences for your life. The leverage that the Trump administration has been using rests on a specific assumption, which is that Canada's dependency on American buyers gives Washington the ability to extract concessions by threatening to make Canadian exports more expensive. And here is the brutal math. Every percentage point of trade that Canada successfully redirects to non-American markets is a percentage point of leverage that Washington permanently loses. Every contract signed with a European buyer, every Asian pipeline shipment, every agricultural deal with China or Japan or Brazil, each one of those transactions is a permanent reduction in the pressure the tariff threat can actually apply. Canada has now recovered 60% of the losses it sustained from American tariffs, with 27 new partners, with the trend accelerating rather than decelerating. But that is not even the part that should most concern American consumers right now. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. It purchases $30 billion in American agricultural goods every year. Canada's retaliatory tariffs were specifically designed to maximize political pressure on American farm states, hitting orange juice from Florida, processed foods from Wisconsin, and agricultural products from states that delivered electoral votes to Trump. Ford Motor Company absorbed $900 million in tariff costs in a single quarter of 2025. Toyota reported a 25% drop in net income with tariff costs of approximately $8 billion. The Barclays research team calculated that Canadian aluminum going into the body of the Ford F-150 alone represents approximately $400 in added cost per vehicle when hit with a 25% tariff, with full supply chain effects potentially pushing the total added cost as high as $3,000 across all makes and models. And those calculations were made with the trade agreement still nominally in place. Remove the agreement entirely, and the consequences for every American who buys a vehicle become catastrophically worse. And here is the timeline that ties all of this together and gives this story its hard deadline: July 1st, 2026. That is when the mandatory review of the USMCA, the agreement governing $1.9 trillion in annual commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, must formally begin. Under Article 34.7 of the agreement, all three parties must confirm in writing that they wish to extend the deal for another 16 years. If any single party declines, the agreement enters a decade-long annual review cycle, leading to mandatory termination in 2036. Any party can also trigger full withdrawal by providing 6 months written notice at any point, and Trump's own trade representative told Congress in January that a rubber stamp renewal was not in the American national interest, keeping all options open, including exit. Today, late March 2026, that deadline is fewer than 100 days away. The U.S. Trade Representative launched its formal preparation discussions with Mexico, bilaterally, without Canada at the table. The American ambassador to Canada confirmed publicly, standing in front of a room full of Canadian farmers in Toronto, that there had been no substantive trade conversation between Washington and Ottawa since October. He called it headwinds. Baker McKenzie, one of the largest trade law firms in the world, noted in their February 2026 review that governments were supposed to submit recommended changes for consideration by June 1st and hold the formal review on July 1st. Those two dates are now approaching with no framework agreement in sight. And the Eurasia Group, whose assessments are used by the largest investment banks and sovereign wealth funds in the world, described the USMCA as a zombie agreement, neither alive nor dead, stumbling toward a deadline with no one steering it. Zombie. That is the word chosen for the agreement that supports 17 million North American jobs and $1.9 trillion in annual commerce. There is one final piece of this story that the coverage consistently underweights. Mark Carney is not a politician who stumbled into economics. He ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, and Canada emerged as one of the most stable G7 nations on earth. He then ran the Bank of England through Brexit, watching firsthand what happens when a country chooses to sever deeply integrated economic ties with its largest trading partner and still survives. He came into Canadian politics for one specific reason, which is that he saw exactly what was coming and believed he was the only person in Canada who knew with precision what to do about it. And he has now said explicitly, publicly, on record, that the old relationship between Canada and the United States, based on steadily increasing integration, is over. The Export Development Canada survey of more than 1,300 Canadian exporters found the sentence that should be required reading for every trade strategist in Washington. What we see is a clear action on the part of Canadian companies who are choosing to adapt to an evolving global trade environment rather than wait for a return to the old world order. That is the language of businesses that have stopped expecting the relationship to go back to what it was. That is the language of permanent structural compounding change. So here is where this story stands tonight. Trump issued the ultimatum. Canada did not fold. Canada accelerated. $11 billion recovered. 27 new trading partners. The second largest monthly surge in non-American exports in recorded history. 12 deals on 4 continents. A prime minister who stood in Davos and told the world the old order is over, and who has spent every single day since turning that declaration into a structural reality. 17 million North American jobs, $1.9 trillion in annual trade. A July 1st deadline approaching at full speed with no substantive negotiations between Washington and Ottawa currently scheduled. And a leverage calculation that started this entire trade war now visibly eroding with every contract Canada signs in Asia, every oil shipment that goes to China instead of the Gulf Coast, every European buyer that locks in a long-term supply agreement with a Quebec aluminum smelter. The man who came into this fight thinking Canada would break because it had nowhere else to go is now watching Canada go everywhere. And the data says that project is succeeding faster than anyone outside of Carney's own team believed was possible. If this video gave you the complete picture, the architecture behind the headlines, the numbers with real context, and the July 1st deadline with everything that surrounds it, share it right now with every American who deserves to understand what is actually at stake. Not just for Canada, for every family in Michigan, every farm in Wisconsin, every auto worker in Ohio, whose economic life is inseparable from the integrated North American economy that is right now stumbling toward its most consequential crossroads in 30 years. We will be right here covering every development between now and July 1st, because the story is moving fast. And the truth about where it is going needs to reach a lot more people than the fragmented coverage is currently reaching.